All right, welcome everyone to our next session, which will be about leveraging geographic context at multiple scales, the salience of the neighborhood in statistical learning and causal analysis. The session is organized by Taylor Oshan from University of Maryland and Levi John Wolf from University of Bristol. And I will leave it to them to introduce the other speakers because it will be a series of short talks. And please, again, post your questions in the Q&A chat. And yeah, stage is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So as it was mentioned, we're going to kind of run it as a lightning session. We've got some shorter talks around 8 to 10 minutes each. So we'll hold off on questions, and then we should have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers and discussion at the end. So we're going to have the batting order. We'll have first up Dr. Anna Petrović, and then we will have Dr. Ziqi Li, then we'll have Dr. Mehak Sachdeva, then we'll have myself, Taylor, and then we'll have Dr. Levi Wolf. So we'll let Anna take it away with the first lightning talk.
Thank you very much, Taylor. First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this session, and let me share my screen. Full screen now. So again, my name is Anna Petrović, and I am based at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands is also our case study in this research. And in this talk, I will explain how to create multi-scale measures of population for understanding segregation over time, space, and scale. And by segregation, I mean ethnic segregation or socioeconomic segregation or segregation based on any population characteristic that we are interested in. And first of all, why is it important to study segregation across various spatial scales? Because it matters to whom we are exposed to just around our homes, but also how larger part of the cities are organized. But how segregation is usually studied is by using administratively defined neighborhoods, such as this one in this map. We see here administratively defined neighborhoods in Amsterdam, showing the share of low-income people and the problems that have been already identified with this, and that we also address in our research. Is that we don't know what is going on in smaller areas and also in larger areas, and also these neighborhoods, they change their boundaries over time, and that also makes it difficult to compare different cities in the same country or in different country. Therefore, what we do and what is the overarching aim of our research is to understand how segregation develops over time and space, but using these multi-scale measures of population. And in this talk, I will explain how we created these measures of population and why they are important to better understand the exposure at different spatial contexts, which is the core of our understanding of residential segregation. So we used geocoded data that are very small scale, so geocoded at a very small spatial scale, 100 by 100 meter grid cells. And just to give you the idea of how large and complex is the data, is that in the Netherlands there are almost 600,000 of these cells, only populated cells. And this is only one of these examples, only one of these neighborhoods. So in this neighborhood, we have a person who lives in this small area, and they have almost no neighbors with a low income. However, when they move a bit farther away from their home, they meet more low income people. Then we have almost all the neighbors that are low income, and as this person moves away further, then the share of low income people drops further, and eventually it reaches something that would be the average of the city where they live. This when we put these measures together, so when we get these values for a range of spatial scales. So starting from this person's home and moving further away across scales, then we get something that we call the distance profile. So we see that on the left side of this slide. So we see it here represented as a line where we have a scale at the horizontal axis and the share of low-income people at the vertical axis. And when we then represent this the same, so it is then the same measure of one specific neighborhood. On the right side is those the same measures, but then represented using color, because we want to focus here only on the scale. So we represent this neighborhood where using color, where this yellow color represent and red specifically represent the higher share of low-income people, and then this line is basically the value of this neighborhood, the changing value of exposure to low-income people over scale for one specific neighborhood in one specific year. If we then stay in the same neighborhood, but then when we look at the time dimension, so we have one specific residential location in the Netherlands, but then when we look what is going on also over time, then we get something like this, that is the picture of this neighborhood, the whole history of how the share of low-income people develops both over a scale, spatial scale, and time. So this is one neighborhood, one of these 600,000 neighborhoods, small neighborhood in the Netherlands. And how the picture of this neighborhood looks like is that over time we have almost the same situation, that only at a smaller scale people are exposed to more poverty, but then this share of low-income people drops over scale. And as you can see, if you focus now on years, is that the situation in this specific neighborhood is more or less the same over years. But then when we move to another neighborhood, we have again that over time is the same. And then over spatial scale, the share of low-income people drops more gradually than comparing to the other, the first neighborhood that we saw. So here we have more gradual change over spatial scale. And then we move to another neighborhood. Our third example is that here we specifically identified the change over time. Here we have a small neighborhood that started as relatively as a neighborhood with almost no low-income people, but then over time, if you look at the end of our study period, at the very end, it becomes actually the neighborhood with almost all low-income people. So it really changed a lot over time, focusing on this small spatial scale. So the change happened specifically at this very small spatial scale, while over at larger scales, actually, so the surrounding of this neighborhood stayed more or less the same. In another neighborhood, the situation is opposite. So it started as a low-income neighborhood, but then it developed further as a neighborhood with almost no low-income people. So why is this important? I am here showing examples of a few neighborhoods. Is that we want to compare a lot of, so we are comparing, actually, not that we want, but we are doing this, comparing all the neighborhoods in the Netherlands, and these are the core measures, and also focusing on people. So because we study segregation, not only that the neighborhood changed, but also people move across neighborhoods. So this person started in one neighborhood with these specific characteristics over scale and over time, and then so for a few years they lived in one neighborhood, and then this person moved to another neighborhood. So their residential history completely changes across spatial scales. And then again, once they move again, then we get here the third part of their residential history, which again encompasses all the the whole range of spatial scales. And here I show the example of only low-income people, exposure to low-income people, but we are looking at a range of characteristics of population and focusing on different measures. So this was only a simple example of the share of low-income people, but we can calculate different segregation indices. As I said, this is the overarching aim to better understand how segregation develops over time, space and scale. And here, since we have the limited time, I wanted to focus on this, on how we actually constructed this measure. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to seeing the other presentation and also our overall discussion at the very end.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna.
Should I just share my screen now?
Yep.
Okay.
Looks
Can you
good.
see this?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Taylor and Levi, for the invitation, and thank you, Anna, for a wonderful presentation. I'll just share some of the work in progress about using XAI to measure contextual effects in machine learning models. Oh, I'm Ziqi Li from Florida State University. So there are many factors are affecting or are kind of correlated with our behaviors. So as geographers, we tend to stress on the location effect, but also at the same time, there are also covariate or some other kind of feature effects are equally important. So if the location operates as its own, it's kind of like just a intrinsic geographic contextual effect. But then when location also interact with other covariate, that's something is termed as a behavior geographic contextual effect. And then at the covariate level, if it just works on its own to the behavior, then it will be either like a linear or a nonlinear effect. But when a covariate A interacts with another covariate, there'll be like an interaction effect to a certain behavior. So as geographers, we kind of more interested in the top part, which is everything interact with location, but at the same time, the bottom part should be also quite important. So given all the effects are operating at the same time, model specification or selection can be challenging for traditional statistical models. So machine learning might be a better alternative because it's flexible and scalable, less assumptions, but it's less interpretable at the same time. Until recently, there have been some methodological developments in the field of explainable AI, specifically local explainable AI, that can provide feature attribution or importance for each observation. And if each observation is georeferenced, then we have this feature importance for each location, essentially. So for example, one of the very popular methods at the moment is based on Shapley value, come from the kind of economics game theory, where it's essentially a permutation-based measure. And the link with model to Shapley value is each covariate or feature is a player in the game, and the model itself is a game, and then different combinations of features, they have a different outcome, and then we can isolate the contribution of one specific feature in the particular model. So in short, essentially it can break down each individual prediction into an additive components. And the great thing for this is, we have comparable magnitudes. So we can compare Shapley values across all the covariates. And then we also have this local explanation. So we do have this kind of breakdown for each individual prediction for each individual observation. So more on Shapley value because of time can be found in a recent paper from myself in Computers, Environment, and Urban Systems, where I was discussing about how to use Shapley value in machine learning model and to get the kind of consistent results compared to spatial statistical models. But here I did find some shortcomings in the original Shapley values, and also the original one doesn't really focus on the location aspect. So here I'm working on a new measure, which is called a Geo-Shapley value. The great thing is it will extend all the theoretical properties from the original Shapley value, but also is able to separate and measure or quantify the different effects that I mentioned in the very first slide. So location effect, location interaction with other covariates, and then covariates as the mole. So to test the method, I did some simulation experiment. So here I just simulate a true additive model with 3 spatially variant processes. So these are kind of processes that with interaction between location and covariate, and then have just a simple linear and simple nonlinear process. So that's kind of what the true model looks like. And then I can use this true model to generate data in the true outcome, and use Geo-Shapley try to explain this true model. And this is just a copy-paste of the true model to this Geo-Shapley additive explanation, which shows that this Geo-Shapley value can exactly explain what the true spatial and non-spatial effects that I defined in the simulation. And then there's kind of some visualization where we can calculate the average spatial or non-spatial effects for each feature, for each partial function. So the red part is the geo effect, and the blue part is the non-geo kind of effect. And you can see that in this particular case, for the last 2 effects, there are no geospatial at all. For the first 3, there's some geospatial, and for the first one, there's just a location itself. But also you will find that by design, the spatial effect for the second covariate is twice as weak as the first covariate. So actually this can be identified from this Geo-Shapley explanation and also this feature attribution kind of plot. So in reality, we don't have this true model. So we only have the real data, which is a black box, which generates a certain prediction. And then we can calculate the Geo-Shapley to sort of infer or explain what is happening within this true model. So I tried, based on still the same simulation data, I tried 7 statistical machine learning models, including the linear regression, Gaussian process model, multiscale geographically weighted regression, and some other machine learning models. And then I computed the Geo-Shapley value. And the great thing for this is this method doesn't, it's not model specific, so we can benchmark the models all together. Before I show the detailed results, here is the kind of model performance across all the models that I used. For this particular one, the neural network and the Gaussian process perform best in this particular case. And then we can see how the models are putting together and how they explain each individual spatially varying or linear or nonlinear process. We can immediately see some of the things here. For example, in a multi-scale geographically weighted regression model, because if we don't specify this nonlinear term explicitly, then it will be only able to model this as a kind of like a linear term. So it's not be able to capture this U shape here. And also we find some tree-based models like gradient boosting and random forest. They're kind of a little bit fuzzy for continuous effect. That's just because they're more discrete because of the mechanism of having decision trees. And in this case, more continuous models that are working well with continuous kind of decision boundaries, like neural network and spatial variant SVM, works better in this case. So lastly, I just want to show a very simple empirical example. Not a particular reason to choose this example, it's just for convenience. I can directly get this from Scikit-learn. And also with latitude and longitude. So this particular data is from the census where there are 8 covariates, try to predict the median house value for a block group in California. And for this particular model, I just choose one which is gradient boosting with 85% of out-of-sample R-square value. And then we can calculate the Geo-Shapley value and visualize the effects attached to each individual feature. We can also see, there for some features there are some part of geo and some part of non-geo. Then I think the user has some option to either you can visualize this as a non-geo, like a non-linear effect, or you want to visualize this as a spatially variant effect. For the median income, for example, we can see the nonlinear effect is actually stronger. So you can visualize this as a nonlinear relationship. And for the very bottom right corner, that's kind of the contribution attributed to the coordinates, right, to the location. There are various kind of explanation for this. You can either, there may be a spatial lag or there may be a spatial error involved, which may can have some further investigation for this specific pattern. Just to summarize, this new measure can explain spatial and non-spatial effects in any supervised kind of machine learning and statistical models. And then it's useful to explore and infer functional form in the model to evaluate performance explanations across the models. And if there are any issues, can also inform the future kind of methodological development for geo AI methods. All right, so that's my last slide. Any questions, feel free to ask at the end of the session.
Thanks, Ziqi.
Yep.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Taylor and Levi, for the invitation. And thank you, Ziqi and Anna, for setting the stage perfectly for this talk. My name is Mehak Sachdeva, and I'm a faculty fellow at New York University within the Center for Urban Science and Progress. This is an exploratory research study that I'm trying to figure out whether profile similarity in conjunction with spatial proximity affects spatial, contextual, and behavioral models, and how we might optimize that by introducing that into local models. So for the presentation, I will first set the stage by talking a little bit about local models and what we know about what they basically what we can basically find out from local models, such as contextual behaviors and spatial proximity behaviors. And then I will talk about how I operationalize the profile similarity measure within these models and where we might take this research from there. So the promise of local models. So basically, techniques within local modeling frameworks help estimate how some intangible contextual effects that are often unmeasurable affect the spatial phenomena of interest. So these models are can estimate spatially varying parameter estimates or associations, which signify the different responses generated in different places given the same external stimuli. And these techniques are also able to estimate unique spatial scales across which processes might vary. And they're also able to estimate contextual effects, which are primary or secondary contextual effects, which is to do with how processes vary due to the location at which the models are being estimated. So local models give us a way of incorporating context and scale into our modeling frameworks, such that we can improve the modeling of the spatial processes. So for example, in a traditional OLS global model, if two houses had the same characteristics, for example, here, house A and house B, for example, we would expect, such as, attributes such as square footage of living area or proximity to a waterfront, we would expect that they'd have similar housing prices given a global model. But that is not true. And we do see that the house prices vary a lot due to the location. So using a local modeling framework where we take into consideration the local contextual effects, we are better able to estimate these intangible effects that the location might be having. So here, houses with the same structural features, but in different areas close to A tend to cost about $1 million more than houses in location close to house B. So such models within the local modeling framework traditionally assume that processes are similar for nearby places and employ spatial proximity weighting, right? So they tend to weight the locations closer in space more heavily than those that are farther away. And that assumption is followed from, that assumption is that processes tend to be similar in places close by. So within local modeling frameworks, such as geographically weighted regression and multiscale geographically weighted regression, there have been instances to include other kinds of these spatial weighting matrices or other kinds of weighting matrices. For example, when the location-specific regression models are calibrated, either we can take points that are close together in space to that one location-specific model, or we can take it in the context of time, or there has also been exploration of doing a contextualized local model where they were borrowing knowledge that we might have from a higher order of an administrative region. So the idea behind this research and this exploration is that, is there a benefit in understanding and including information from places that might be similar in attribute space or profile similarity, rather than just concentrating on spatial proximity and looking at the geographic space? So the objective of this research is, it basically asks the following questions. So do places that are similar in the attribute space also have similar processes? And if so, is there a way to use weights from locations that are similar in this attribute space, the X space that we are talking about? And in what scenarios would such a model work better than using the spatial distance weighting, which basically takes into consideration the geographic proximity? And ideally, can there be a scenario where we can combine spatial proximity and profile similarity weights to gather as much information as possible from the known phenomena to understand the processes that might be affecting it? So more intuitively, in a scenario where houses A and B, which are farther apart in distance, such as shown in this map, but are similar in attributes such as living area or waterfront access. So the question here is, would a local model estimation benefit with the inclusion of information from house B in the local model that is calibrated at house A? So this is the intuitive setup of why this might be beneficial. So I'll talk briefly about how I operationalize this profile similarity weighting. And I won't be able to get into details of a lot of results, but I would love feedback on this. And if conceptually and theoretically this entire idea makes sense, because that's the stage at which this research is at. So basically, to do this, what I basically did was that I defined a similarity index in the X space, which is the attribute space, which is different from the distance geographic space that we have been doing, that is more common in local models. And by defining this similarity index using multi-dimensional scaling measures, I'm able to then build a weighting matrix in the attribute space. Right. So once we have that weighting matrix, we can then run the local models by taking locations closer in attribute space together and running the location specific model for each of those locations, and then basically understanding the similarity based weighting associations as we would for the spatially weighting associations. So then I calibrate the local model using this new weighting matrix. and ideally combine these two weighting matrix to see whether that model outperforms the one that we are using more commonly, which is the spatial proximity weights. So initially, I did some simulation experiments where I took two contrasting scenarios. One was basically where the processes were completely spatially dependent, and one where there was complete attribute similarity dependence. And using those simulation experiments, it was clear that the profile-based similarity index worked better in the scenario 2, and the spatial dependence based spatial weighting matrix worked better in scenario 1. So what I'm going to focus now a little bit is on the using this particular idea in a real world data scenario, because that is where we don't really know whether the processes are completely spatially spatial proximity dependent, or is there also value in adding profile-based similarity weighting matrix. So I take this model from Fotheringham et al., where they look at voting behavior using the presidential election data for 2016 in the United States at the county level. And I run two models side by side. One is using the geographic coordinate space, and the other is using the contextual coordinate space. So in the left-hand side model, we are running it on the administrative units, which are basically based on how many counties are taken together to run that local model, based on that people closer together tend to behave similarly, and those processes tend to affect the phenomena, which is the voting behavior in this case, similarly. And on the right-hand side, I define this new coordinate space, which is basically based on the similarity across these X attributes that are used in this paper, which include sex ratio, percentage of Hispanic population, percentage of African American population, education, income, and so on. And across these X attributes, which counties tend to be similar versus not. So just to quickly show what that would look like, this is basically, on the left-hand side, you see that this is the geographic coordinate space. So when I select these counties, say in Arizona, the right-hand side points also get activated. And you see that they are not necessarily closer together in the similarity space. So the profile similarity, for example, this one is so close together in the geographic space, but it is right here on the edge of the similarity context. So we see that the geographic space and similarity space is doing basically different things. And that is interesting to then start to understand what this model might then be telling us. So going back to the model, so this is the estimate for the local intercept, the contextual measure that I was talking about initially with the housing example. And what we find here is, so first of all, I just mentioned one fit criterion here, but the model does seem to be doing well in the similarity weighting space as well. And that is through various fit measures and not just the R-square. So there is some value in using that information from counties that might be similar in profile and not just proximal by distance. And then in that case, then what are these maps then telling us? Like what are these contextual measures then trying to indicate? So on the left-hand side, we see that this is the geographic coordinate space, and this is what the intercept looks like, where given all the attributes of the county to be similar, counties here tend to vote more red, and counties in the northwest, for example, tend to vote blue. And on the right-hand side, you see in the similarity space, the measure is basically not weighting that much, and the scale of the entire process is different, and the entire interpretation then changes. So to quickly run over one more example, we see that consistently with a lot of parameter estimates, but they are not necessarily different or from each other, right? So for the geographic coordinate space, we find that as percentage of African American population goes up, the voting behavior turns more blue, whereas and similarly on the similarity profile side, also we see similar behavior, given that all other profiles are similar for these locations. We also find some contradictory results, which is basically for percentage of Hispanic population. on the left-hand side, we see that it's generally a similar trend, and the scale tends to be similar too. But on the right-hand side, in the similarity space, we find these basically these small red bubbles where we find that these counties tend to be similar in these X attributes, and they tend to behave differently with this one external stimuli, which is increase in percentage of Hispanic population. So you see that when I highlight these on the left-hand side, you see that different counties across the United States highlight. So they are basically clubbed together in terms of their X similarity and not their spatial proximity. So again, this was a very brief talk about where this work is going. But the next steps definitely are combining these two matrices, weight matrices, to understand whether addition of this profile similarity measure can enhance how we estimate and talk about spatial processes, or what we know about how the phenomena that we are looking at in social and natural sciences works. So ideally, we would want to do a parametric combination of the two weighting matrices, which is not very easily possible. So there are ways in which we are trying to get around this issue to understand which weighting matrix in which phenomenon might be more informative. So yeah, actually, this is more of an exploration in the sense that I'm not fully clear even now what this might mean in terms of, like, when we are looking at the spatially varying and profile-based varying parameter estimates and the contextual measures, but it definitely adds information to understanding the phenomenon, but it also raises a lot more exploratory questions of what this means and where we might go next from there. Thank you. That was.
Oh. Right. Thank you, Mehak. So myself is up next. All right. Can you see my slides? All right.
Yes.
All right, awesome. So I'm going to keep my talk kind of quick, just to make sure we've got some time at the end for questions and discussions, because we've got one more after myself as well. So I'll be talking about a new method called Generalized Additive Spatial Smoothing that I have been exploring along with PhD student Mengyu Lao here at University of Maryland. So before I get into more of what the method is, talk a little bit about the motivation. So the modern eco-data system is heterogeneous. We often have data at a lot of different spatial supports, points, polygons, street segments. So if we look at the example of something like bike sharing stations, we might be interested in some data that are related to them. So we've also got things like housing, or how many people live nearby those stations. We might have things like restaurants, cafes, bars that are also around those bike stations, and we want to know how they might be related to bike activity. So one way we can try and combine these different heterogeneous data sources is by taking things like a census delineation, where we might also have important information about populations and their socio-demographic attributes. And we can use those polygons and we can aggregate everything to those polygons, and then we might do some kind of a regression analysis at that polygon unit. So this is the idea of changing the support and how we can handle that so that we can take these different data sets and get them into a spatial regression framework. So an alternative way that we might do that, instead of using those polygons, is using some kind of distance-based or kernel-based weighting mechanism. We might say, even just a buffer, we want to take all of the data that is in with some distance of the bike station of interest. And we can do this then for each bike station. So here we have we need to have some kind of automated selection of this ring size. So here we've got the ring size as a proxy for scale. It doesn't necessarily have to be a ring size. It could be a distance or a distance decay. So that's kind of the open problems that we're looking at, is this idea of change of support, and then also how do you select this appropriate distance or ring size. So the methodology itself for generalized additive smoothing, it combines this idea of generalized additive modeling a really general statistical framework with the idea of spatial smoothing. So spatial smoothing has kind of already been introduced in the previous talks in the context of geographically weighted regression. This is a bit similar, but instead of having the local estimators, we're actually taking just the sum or average of the values within a kernel, and we're still staying within a kind of global traditional modeling framework. So here we have these additive spatial smoothers that are denoted by S, and we're taking a covariate and we smoothed it so that the things that are closer to some kind of calibration point or point of interest are weighted more heavily than those that are further away. And so that parameter that controls that smoothness here are hyperparameters that we can fit using backfitting within the GAM framework. And the neat thing is that we can also have confidence intervals for that smoothing parameter, that hyperparameter, that can give us some kind of certainty about the value of that parameter. So to build up some kind of intuition, we ran a little bit of a simulation. So here we have blue points that are considered our data points. That would be kind of like our dependent variable spatial support. And we'd like to get information to be on the same level or spatial support as those blue points. But unfortunately, we have the POIs that are distributed around them that are a different spatial support. So in this setup, we've got the two different spatial supports, and we'd like to smooth the points from the orange into the supports of the blue. So we set this up and we pretend that we have known values for the beta coefficients, the regression coefficients that are associated with three different terms. So one term is at the blue support, and then two of them are at an additional spatial support. So here we've got beta 1 is equal to beta 2, which is equal to the beta for the POIs surrounding them, all a value of 1. And then we set the two different spatial smoothing terms so that they have different distance decays or different scales. Here we have negative 0.5 and negative 0.1. So the kind of findings that we're able to find, just to summarize kind of quickly, is that we're able to replicate all of the regression coefficients as well as recover those scale parameters. So we're taking those hyperparameters and now we're interpreting them in terms of scale. And we also get this nice confidence interval. We've used two different methods to test that around those parameters. So there's a little bit of fluctuation around the true values, but overall we can recover them pretty well even with uncertainty. So that's always nice. We've got a simulation that kind of confirms our intuition, but we'd also like to know how things work for an empirical expectation. What do we expect empirically to happen? So we looked at returning to the bike station example. We've got bike stations, bike sharing stations in Brooklyn, New York. And we've got those in orange. And then around it, we've got point of interest for bars, restaurants, cafes, and shopping. Then we've also got census blocks where we have some information about the number of jobs. So we look at these three variables, numbers of jobs, the capacity at docks, at the stations themselves, and then the points of interest. And we would expect each of those to increase the number of values or be related to the number of trips that end at each station. So that's the dependent variable of interest here. So we have two approaches we could look at. The first one is kind of the naive approach. We could use the census blocks because we're using those for the number of jobs, employment, and we could aggregate everything to those blocks. So that's kind of the strategy on the left. And we then kind of lose a bunch of information because we need to aggregate everything up to a larger scale. Alternatively, we could use the approach that is to use generalized additive spatial smoothing, where we smooth everything onto the support of the dependent variable of interest, that's the station level. So here we then keep everything at the station level, and using the smoothing, the station capacity is already at that support. Employment and points of interest are then transformed into the support of the stations, and this is done within the regression modeling routine itself. So just to summarize the findings, I've got the table there, but the kind of just synopsis is that the model fit doubles when we do that. We get that the number of jobs becomes positive and significant, when in the naive approach, it was actually a negative and insignificant relationship that was found. The job effects is more localized, and that's because it has the more negative kind of hyperparameter that goes with that. So that means it's less smooth, and more nearby jobs are more important for estimating that relationship. The POI's effect is less localized, meaning that the information is borrowed from a little bit further away, less nearby, and it's more of a smooth surface. So then just to kind of wrap up, what is the GISS method? So it's multiscale. So that's the bottom part of the figure here. So each variable that we're smoothing can be smoothed at its own scale. It's data driven. So we're using the regression itself to estimate what the appropriate scale is, when oftentimes these types of buffers or thresholds are just chosen kind of out of convenience or arbitrarily. It's egocentric, so that's the top part of the figure, meaning that we focus on a context around each individual observation point. It embeds change of support within the regression itself, and then it's kind of extensible because it's within the GAM framework and can be combined with any other GAM extensions. So I'll leave it there. Pass that on to Levi.
Cool, thanks. Hello. Thank you everybody for bearing with us today. I'm the last presenter in this sequence. So let me just share my screen and we'll be ready to go. My name is Levi John Wolf. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. Could I get some confirmation that everybody can see my slide deck?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so I'll get started without much further ado. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit about a new innovation I've come up with in the problem of clustering regression. And I'm calling it a new metalearner for local data science. You've heard a lot from the different speakers today about either different projects in applying local data science or developing new models in local data science. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about a new kind of meta learner in this space. So to do that, I need to talk a little bit about what clustering regression is, and then how it's applied in geographical problems. I'm proposing that quadtrees provide us with a better kind of algorithmic data structure for us to build good clustering regression. And I'm going to show you, if I have time, some of the results that can come out of a clustering regression approach, like a quadtree regression. So first, let's start thinking a little bit about what do I mean by clustering regression? Well, at its most basic, I'm talking about jointly solving a clustering problem inside of a regression problem. So the kind of oldest approach to do this that I can find is this Spath's three-stage solving process, where you kind of solve a k-means inside of a regression, and you optimize the fit of the clusters based on the fit of the regression. So Sugasawa and Murakami have a spatial variant of this that's quite recent. It's very interesting. It uses the same kind of conceptual approach as the Spath approach from about 40, 50 years ago. But it has some drawbacks, namely that it's not necessarily guaranteed to be optimal. It's computationally intensive and likelihood dependent. It's not sparse, and it has no guarantee of recovering the original classes in a situation where we know what the classes are. So just to give an example of this kind of iterative updating approach, imagine we have two regression lines, and we know that kind of in theory, we actually have two different types of observations. Here I've got the red observations and I've got the green observations. The kind of Spath heuristic provides us with a way to solve a k-means problem inside of a regression problem to try and recover two slopes that fit the data. And so how this works generally is this kind of relabeling procedure that I'm showing you now in this animation. So you can see that the red and green lines are gradually kind of trading observations between red and green, and we're getting two progressively different slopes, right? So you're kind of reassigning observations to one line or another line based on the fit that you can obtain for the regression line. And you'll notice at the end, you get this optimal break. And the two regression lines that are assigned describe the fit optimally between the two clusters that are found. The problem with these algorithms is that the data-driven kind of fit optimizing technique gives us no guarantee, even with regularization or cross-validation, that the clusters that we find are true in any objective sense. So a lot of these iterative clustering algorithms are really useful for spatial prediction, but they're not necessarily as useful for inferential purposes. We can't be sure that we're recovering true clusters when we apply these kinds of iterative clustering techniques. So again, this is that they trade observations between the two different groups, they fit regressions in those two different groups, and the goal is to try and recover some optimal, some true break, like I'm showing you here. So these are clustering regression techniques, and they've long been a problem in signal processing and computer science. And Sugawa and Murakami have developed a recent extension for space where we're trying to partition geographically and then fit regressions in an optimal way. So to talk a little bit about how these geographical clustering regression problems are generally solved, I'd like to focus in on one particular extension. And this extension by Luke Anselin and Pedro Amaral, what they call scatter reg or endogenous regimes regression. It uses the same kind of spath-like approach, but it operates a little differently. So instead of doing this kind of solving a k-means inside of a regression, they use everybody's favorite spatial clustering technique, scatter, to solve a clustering regression where the fit of the regression model, when we use the features, the cluster labels as features, the fit that we get in the regression using those features is the clustering objective. So we're trying to find clusters in data that optimize the fit of some regression. So it's kind of like the clustering happens inside of the supervised learning model. And for those of you that are aware with how scatter works, the scatter spatial clustering algorithm builds a minimum spanning tree, which I'm calling an MST. And then it finds cuts in that MST that make for good looking geographical clusters. And it's a well-used kind of heuristic clustering technique. It has no guarantee of optimality, but it usually works pretty well in spatial problems. And what I really like about these approaches is that they spend their degrees of freedom judiciously, right? In local models, like some of the ones we've seen today, we get, generally speaking, we get a different model for every location in our data set, and sometimes even for locations that we don't have in our data set. Whereas these kinds of clustering regression approaches seek to provide us a space partitioning that then we fit models inside of those spaces. So it's a little bit different. We might get a hyperlocal model in one area where there's a lot of data, but we don't get a model at every single data point. So a good example of what a scatter regression result might look like is here. We've used scatter to find a couple of different clusters. I'm showing you them in different colors. And the minimum spanning tree I've drawn across the observations in gray. And that minimum spanning tree, remember, just touches all of the observations, and the scatter algorithm then finds the observations to disconnect, such as here, we might have removed a link that connected this forest here from this larger collection of observations. And scatter regression is useful for then finding these clusters and then fitting regressions inside of them. And then the fit that we get in predicting all of the different clusters separately is generally better than we get when we predict everybody lumped together. Now, scatter regression is built on top of scatter, and scatter has a few problems, especially in large data and in kind of data scientific applications. And one of the really critical ones that I'd like to talk about today is that scatter is very finicky under cross-validation. In addition, the algorithm provides you no total order in terms of its partitioning of space. It also isn't very clearly able to do out-of-sample prediction. So I'll show you a couple of examples. When I'm talking about it being finicky in CV, I'm talking about what I'm showing you here. The red outlines represent the clusters from one realization. And the black overlaid lines, or underlaid lines technically, are cluster boundaries from many different cross-validations. And if the clustering approaches were effective, you should generally find fuzzy black boundaries around the red boundaries. They should be generally stable cluster boundaries that happen every time we fit the data, or we fit the model on the data after just taking off 20% for cross-validation. And you can see that some of the very distinctive clusters, such as the one in the top right, do kind of remain somewhat whole. But in general, we just look like we're getting a giant spider web, a big black mass. Some people call a ball of yarn. But the scalar regression is just completely unstable when you want to cross-validate. It has really no capacity to work out of sample in this way. And some of that is because there's no total order in the algorithm. For really small changes in the data, the minimum spanning tree can change really significantly. And that's because the minimum spanning tree is constructed as like a very simple kind of graph theoretic way to connect observations up to make it easy for us to then snip them into clusters, right? So you can see that in some cross-validation splits, the two observations I've highlighted are direct neighbors, and they're unlikely to ever be separated. But in other splits, they're actually one of the most distant pairs of observations in the entire graph. And this doesn't have anything to do with the context around these observations. It doesn't have anything to do with the observations' values themselves. In fact, they're similar and would generally be grouped according to the scalar regression. But in fact, the issue here is that the minimum spanning tree that is derived for this point cloud is entirely dependent on these really small fluctuations in the data. So it's not really robust when it comes to these kinds of things. And this property is actually used by people to fit scalar ensembles and work with the ensemble of possible outcomes. But here I'm showing you in particular that that ensemble might not necessarily be meaningful in a regression case. In addition, because of this sensitivity and kind of issue with cross-validation, it's unclear really how to generate out-of-sample predictions from these kinds of models. Yes, we get this ability to partition space, and we could draw a convex hull or a concave hull, like an alpha shape, around each of these clusters and call it a boundary. But what happens when I have an observation that's not even in the tree or very far from the tree? It's not optimal just to connect it back to the tree's nearest neighbor. It's also not optimal to redraw the tree because the splits that we made to make the clusters might actually not be present in that new tree. Basically, what I'm suggesting to you is that minimum spanning trees are really good for problem simplification, but they're not good for spatial indexing. They're very data dependent and very sensitive to the precise configuration of the data. So this means that we need a better way to organize our clustering regression. Minimum spanning trees just aren't stable enough to deal with this noise. Fortunately for us, we have a lot of really good spatial indexes. The one I'm talking about today will be quadtrees. And instead of making graph-based splits on a minimum spanning tree, we're going to make spatial splits for spatial fits. For those of you who haven't seen a quadtree before, its most common application is in spatial indexing and image compression. Here is an example from Wikipedia, where we can see that as the image kind of gets higher resolution, on the right, we can see that patches of color that remain the same on the left can be kind of left at a higher resolution. Fundamentally, this is how quadtrees work. They split the problem into quadrants and then assess if splitting it further would give us any kind of loss in information. Once that loss in information gets too small for us to notice, we don't split our cell. So you can see, such as the large cells on the notepad there in the new example, those cells remain quite large because the color in that area is pretty much constant. Whereas when you have a lot of contrast, like happens on the keyboard in the top part of the image, we need a lot of resolution in order to not lose a lot of detail there. So quadtrees are useful in a couple of different ways, and most people are familiar with the, sorry, what?
We've got to wrap up.
Oh, shit, okay. I didn't realize that we were that short. So let me just show you what the results of this kind of application look like. They are stable in CV, they're totally ordered, and they have a very simple out-of-sample update. We get local coefficient surfaces like you might in a standard local model, and we only spend the detail where we need to. So you can see, like, for example, this kind of local approach, we get spaces at a premium in the south of Seattle, but the degrees of freedom used are an order of magnitude less than GWR for about the same efficiency of fit, and they fit in a minute. It'll be MIT licensed, it'll be released in PySal with a publication coming along, and it's very high performance. So I'm sorry that I don't have more time to discuss the concept. I didn't realize that I was running that short. But yes, supervised quadtrees are a good way for you to incorporate either clustering or regression as a meta-heuristic if you want to kind of have an online, updatable local regression. So thank you very much. And with that, I'll yield my time.
Thanks, Levi. I think that wraps up the session.